Hey there, you're watching the Aussie BIM Guru. Today I've got a really quick video that comes from a user request, which is a good one, and it's on a technique that I use very often when I'm programming. In this case, it's calling on an element at a later date using something that's unique to that element so we can match it. In this case, it's going to be an element ID of an element in a Revit model. So the only reason we really you need to do this is if we need to call on an element when we've taken it away from an environment or moved it to another environment, such as importing it to Rhino and matching up its ID and its name. In order to move data between them or reintroduce data to that element, or just reliably call on that element in any form. We might not be able to use some fields that you might think are unique. For example, a room name you might think is unique, but as you know in Revit, you can have rooms with the same name. So we can't actually match these elements when we come back to Revit based on their name, for example. So in this case, we use an ID as well because the user can't modify this property. So in this case, if people go and rename things in the middle of an export and an import process, it's going to mess up things if you're going to rely on that when you return back to the model or a number. But an element ID, a user can't change it. So in this case, I'm going to be using Dynamo 2.3, but this is a fundamental technique that works in pretty much any version of Dynamo you'll come across. And as well as this, I'll be using my custom package Crumple in order to use some time-saving nodes as well. Anyway, let's jump in.
So I'm just working in a basic model here, and let's say I want to use Dynamo to make some updates to the names and the numbers of these rooms. Sometimes it's really hard to find a rule to use in Dynamo. Sometimes it's easy, maybe you want to make all the room names uppercase, which is something Dynamo can easily do, but maybe you want to change things to very explicit things instead. So let's just have a look at one of these rooms. If I select this room, and I go to the Manage tab, and I check IDs of selection, you'll note that this element has a unique or an element ID specific to the model. And we're going to take advantage of this element ID in order to pass data back and forth between the element. So in this case, this ID isn't editable. So when the element is created, Revit will assign this ID to it. So you can rely on this being consistent as long as it's the same element between import-export workflows. So I've already set up a script in the background just to export my data. I'm just taking my rooms by placement, which is a node from Crumple, which will just export all the rooms that, in this case, have an area, which means that they're placed in the model. You might be aware that rooms can be unplaced sometimes, which can cause problems when you're trying to export data to Excel, for example. Now I'm getting the elements ID using the element.id node, and this will return the ID of that element. In this case, I might just freeze this node. And we can see now that we have that element ID available, and we're going to use this to match the element on the way back in from Excel. As well as this, I'm just getting the number and the name, joining them into a list, and I'm transposing that list into rows, and then just adding a header row. And finally, exporting it to Excel. And I've taken this data into Excel already over here. And I've made some modifications to it. So in this case, I've modified the room numbering logic, and I've also made all the rooms uppercase. Maybe I wish to make some changes to the actual names as well. And obviously this is a much faster and easier way than trying to find some sort of logic in Dynamo itself. So for example, the things I just did there would have taken quite a few rules. For example, replace all instances of bath with bathroom, but maybe I want to still say master bath. So it's hard to find rules that are quick and easy to set up in Dynamo sometimes. It's important to make sure you do not change this column and you keep it aligned to the elements in the model, because this is the element ID we're going to match them to. Everything in all the other columns is essentially irrelevant when it comes to matching that data back in Revit after. Anyway, I'm going to take my room data and I'm just going to start working from another script I've just begun setting up, which is going to import my Excel data. Now I'm using a custom node from Crumple here called Quick Import Excel. I always find that importing Excel data is a really slow process to set up. So instead I just packaged all the functions into a custom node, and all you need to give it is a file path, and that it assumes that the first sheet in that Excel file is sheet 1, which it usually is. It assumes that we don't want to do as strings by default. So in this case, we do actually want to do as strings. Usually we're not going to show Excel. I'm just taking out the first header row, so I'm going to drop that row into a separate output. And I'm also going to transpose my data, and there's an optional replacement for null or empty cells. So it's just a little bit of a time saver. But now we can see we have our headers and then also our data in 3 sublists. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to index those pieces of data. I'm firstly going to say that I'll just say ID equals out 0. I'll say that name equals out 1. Now you don't have to give these variable names, but sometimes people find it easier to understand what they're looking at. So what this is going to do is just give one variable of out, and it's going to split them into their individual sublists. So I'm indexing the first sublist, the second one, and the third one. So now I can work with these separately. Now, the question is, how do we get back, in this case, my phone alarm just went off, whoops. So the question now is, how do we get back these elements by ID? There's a few ways we can do it. I'm going to show you the long way first. This is sort of the way without using any design script or custom nodes. So if I get a all elements of category node, I'm just going to try and get all the rooms in my model. So in this case, I'm going to call on the category of rooms. And now I can see I have 14 rooms with their IDs. Now, you might not necessarily have the same number of rooms that come in the model, so you can't just work with this list of rooms, assuming they're in the same order as before. Instead, what we need to do, and just to simulate this, I am going to shuffle this list of rooms. You don't need to do this, but I'm going to shuffle them anyway. So now they're in an absolutely random order, and they're definitely not lined up to our data anymore. So what we can do is get the element ID of those rooms from the model as they currently stand. Now we need to find out in this list of IDs, where does the ID of the actual room in Revit occur? So in this case, we're going to be looking at finding an index of. So in this case, from our overall list of elements, where does each ID occur? Now at the moment, it's not going to work because it's going to work across the whole list, which in this case is just an object. What we need to do is say at level 2 and also at level 1, and I think as well as this, we might have a data type mismatch in this case as well, I think. Yeah, we probably do. So in this case, I'm going to say string to number. And I'm going to turn my element ID into a number. Now we also need to set this to longest lacing. I don't believe it works without levels. I'll just double check. It looks like actually we can probably do this without levels. So we can now see the index of where that ID occurs in this list. So actually you don't need levels there, sorry. But now we're going to do get item at index. And from our original list of rooms, we're going to take that corresponding index. And now if we have a look at our IDs, we can see that they're matching. So we've essentially reordered our data. And now we know that this data that we're resetting to the element is going to fall in the same order as the ID list as well, which is perfect. And this can be really important if you're working in a model with lots of rooms and maybe people have added rooms, taken away rooms since then, which would definitely mean your list is out of order. And what I'm going to do is put this off to the side and show you a couple more slightly direct methods that can do this using custom nodes typically. But I'm just going to group this off. And I might actually need string to number still, potentially. I think I do. Yep. You could say not to read as strings, but I do prefer to treat all other data in the Excel file as text in this case, which is much easier because we do have some numbers that are technically in the form of a number. Okay, so there's another custom node in my custom package, and a lot of custom packages have this node. In this case, I think it should be called element by ID. And this, given an ID, we'll just go and find the corresponding element if it exists in the model. So obviously much more direct than this method up here, but it's good to understand the logic of how you can cross-index elements like that. This is a very, very common technique that I use, not just in the context of element IDs, when I'm trying to match up data by its properties. Now this custom node is actually quite simple. It's actually just using some embedded design script. So in this case, we can see it's revit.elements.elementSelector.byElementID, and then the variable of the ID itself. And this command essentially allows you to retrieve an element by its corresponding ID. I'm quite surprised there isn't just a node, I guess, that does this. Maybe there is one somewhere in the default nodes, but I haven't seen one if there is. I mean, if it is, it would be under Revit elements element. but I don't think there's an element by ID node. No, there's only the option to get the ID. But I think at least half the custom packages I have installed have very similar nodes to this one. That may work in more efficient ways, I'm not sure. But otherwise, this is essentially how we can get the data in the right order. From here, maybe say you don't find some elements aren't matching. In this case, you may need to actually do like a filter by Boolean mask based on an is null condition for the rest of your data to make sure that you've cleaned out any data that isn't actually finding a match. But hopefully in most cases, every piece of data should find a match if the rooms are still there. Now in this case, the last thing we need to do is actually just set these parameter values to the element itself. So in this case, I'm just going to get an element.parameters node, just so I can inspect what's actually in this element. Now I'm going to say x index 0 to just take the first room. I don't want to get the parameters of every single room. I just want to inspect one of them. So we can see we're looking for name and number. In this case, we do have a name parameter and we also have a number parameter. So we're going to call on these parameters by name. So I'm going to get an element.setParameter by name. And I'm going to get two of them actually. And at this point, I'm probably going to switch to manual mode. I'm going to take my rooms. I'm going to take my numbers, my names and my numbers. And I'm also just going to create a code block, and I'm just going to get the parameter for name and also for number, which will give me two rows that I can use just to connect up those parameters. And at this point, assuming I've set this all up correctly, which isn't always the case, if I press run, there we go. We can see that we've adopted both our name and number. Now I think in this case I actually have got them the wrong way around. So what I might need to do is invert that relationship. There we go. But you can see that the ID is what's holding that all together. So I just switched the names and the numbers, and it didn't confuse Dynamo at all because it still has those element IDs available. So just remember that this is a really important technique, not only in Dynamo, but just in programming in general. It's pretty much the fundamental concept of how we can interoperate between platforms as long as there's a common ID. If you work with things like IFC, for example, you'll know that there's an IFC GUID as well, which is essentially the key handle for an element to maintain its consistency in a model. But there we go.
So I hope that was a useful video on a fundamental data matching technique, and it teaches you more about how you can better control your data flow when working between platforms or formats. Thanks for the request, and if you have any more, feel free to send them my way. Lots of videos to make and always not enough time, but I'll do my best. Anyway, if you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Thanks, take care.